This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. April 22nd marks Earth Day. 10 years ago on this day, leaders from around the world gathered at the UN headquarters in New York for the signing ceremony of the Paris Agreement. In that moment, countries came together around a shared goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius while striving to keep it to 1.5. A decade on, where does the global fight against climate change stand today? Joining us now is Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at University College London. Professor Grubb, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you very much.
So, on Earth Day 2016, the Paris Agreement was opened for signature at the UN headquarters in New York, and that moment was marked by a sense of historic unity. So 10 years on, how much of that spirit still remains, and are we on track to meet its goals?
Well, history always goes in some cycles, and yes, Earth Day 2016, signing of the Paris Agreement, universal signing, was a high point. Obviously, now today the world in general is in a different place. There's a lot of tension, a lot of division geopolitically. And we have a US president who's largely denied climate change all along and has pulled out. So, yes, we're in a different place. But I think it's also worth adding there are many worries going up to COP30, the last conference of parties in Brazil in November, that actually some other countries at least would follow the US. Argentina had said it might, others were humming. Actually, COP30 was a real display of unity around the principle that no single country would destroy a global effort like the Paris Agreement. There was consistent reaffirmation, recommitment to the Paris Treaty. So institutionally, it was a statement that multilateralism of the kind embodied in the Paris Agreement is something that all of the other countries still valued, still committed to. Are we on track to meet its goals? That really depends which of its goals you're talking about, so we could come on to that. But yes, the process is still on track. Maybe a final remark is, in some ways, the international reaction to the US pullout, a formal withdrawal now, is much more muted than it would have been 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, because it's been a long-term difficult relationship with the US following changes in the US government. This is the third time the US has pulled out of an agreed global treaty. So there is a reaction I pick up elsewhere that maybe if the US cannot be consistent, it's better if it's out of the system, at least for present, until it sorts out internal disputes on climate change.
Yes, that's true. But we know that earlier this year, it also walked away from this UNFCCC, which is the parent framework of the Paris Agreement. But this is supposed to be a global consensus. But do you think it can continue to function when a primary architect of the system just leaves the room?
So I think that is a really crucial question. I think that the goal of tackling climate change within a multilateral framework does continue, and it is relevant. The key reason why that is possible in a way that wouldn't have been possible 10 to 20 years ago is because of the scale of innovation in clean technology and a sense that, to be crude, there is money to be made in the low carbon economy, and that it also can help to insulate many countries from geopolitical energy shocks of the kind we see now. So I think, yes, obviously it's a real pity, great regret if the US is not willing to participate. But if that's the case, it's better that we accept that situation and say, okay, there is still a global climate problem that has to be solved. And the US is a big country, but it is a declining share of global emissions. Even this year, or last year under Trump, the US was installing far more renewable energy than new fossil fuels. So there are global trends that, encompass what happens in the US as well, whether or not it's formally part.
Yes, and I think one of the most important goals of the Paris Agreement is obviously this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But scientists say that we may have already temporarily exceeded that goal in recent years. So, does that mean the Paris target is effectively slipping out of reach? And should the global climate conversation now shift?
So, the Paris temperature target was very carefully negotiated, and it was to stay well below 2 degrees and to strive for 1.5. Now, to be honest, I was always skeptical whether 1.5 was possible, because it was so close and it would involve such dramatic emission reductions that it seemed to me unlikely that political systems around the world could deliver it. I think that is now very obvious. I think it's clear, to be honest, we are not going to stay below 1.5 degrees. Some countries are continuing to honour the obligation to strive towards emissions that would be consistent with that. But there's a big difference between 1.5 and 2. There is a difference in climate impacts, obviously, but there is a huge difference in terms of the feasibility of delivering it. So, do I think that staying well below 2 degrees is possible? Yes, it is still possible. Obviously, the longer we delay action, the more difficult it becomes, but there is substantial progress anyway. So I think, yeah, that part of the Paris target is within reach. Maybe worth adding, the reason for that range in the Paris Agreement is 1.5 was there because several of the most vulnerable countries said, well, that is already dangerous for us. And that is what the UN process was supposed to try and protect. But many countries insisted that the target was well below 2 degrees as the actual commitment because they just didn't think they could deliver 1.5. So, in that sense, I think that yes, that goal is still achievable when you really understand exactly what governments committed to.
Well, and of course, we also have good news. Like as you mentioned earlier, we are seeing record growth in renewables. And according to UN data, global renewable electricity capacity has increased by 140% since the signing of the Paris Agreement, while fossil fuel capacity has grown by just 16%. Yet, global emissions are still inching upward. So, how do we explain this disconnect? Like, are we still not transitioning fast enough?
I think it's fair to say we're not transitioning fast enough, but we are transitioning at a growing pace. So, first, I think it's not that surprising that one can have that rapid expansion in clean electricity and yet global emissions have still been going up, because electricity is only part of the problem, and also those renewables were starting from a relatively small base. So, to give you a flavor of the kind of pace of change and where that leads is 10 years ago, wind and solar energy combined were a bit under 10% of global electricity. Now it looks like by 2030, so in only 4 years' time, that figure will be close to 30%. And that's a reflection of exponential growth. So, that is still accelerating. And I think actually the current geopolitical crisis is accelerating that further. Now, that's still only electricity, much slower progress on other things. But to be fair, most of the other things depend on having clean electricity. So, the most obvious is electric vehicles. We see the price of gasoline going up now. Every day at the moment, I'm seeing headlines about acceleration of efforts on electric vehicles, and increasingly we will have the renewable electricity or zero carbon electricity to fuel that. So scientists talk about an S-curve dynamics. Things never sort of grow linearly. When they're really small, they can't suddenly become huge. They have to grow by an exponential process. So you get from 1%, 2%, 4%, 8%, you're heading 10, 15, 20, and then the absolute volume really starts to impact. We've seen that in China. China's emissions, as I understand it, have stayed steady for the last 2 years and may even be dipping down. And I think that is a really interesting and important indication. We're beginning to see the peak in the world's biggest emitting country at present.
Yes, but in the meantime, I think we also have, new demands for electricity. Like in some countries, we're seeing a surge in power demand driven by AI and these data centers. So is the digital revolution kind of running ahead of or even undermining the green transition?
This is a really good question. This is, I think, one of the big, well, in English we call it jokers in the pack. You don't know quite what it will do. I have seen all kinds of different claims about AI and data centers and energy use. No question, they take a lot of energy at the moment. We see different data center technologies that have very different levels of energy demand. We see a lot of talk about, is the AI boom overhyped? In other words, actually, there's a lot of people pouring a lot of money because they think there's a lot of business in it, but we're starting to see quite a lot of cancellations of data centers as well. We're also seeing, curiously, significant resistance to the energy demand of some of these data centers, which are driving up energy prices, not least in the United States, and straining some of the gas supplies. I think I'm not a deep expert on AI, but I'll make a last word, which is I heard the head of computer science at Cambridge University, when asked exactly this question, he said, "Oh, I don't think that will be a problem." He said, "Because in a couple of years we can ask AI how to reduce its energy use by a factor of 10, and it will come up with lots of answers." I thought that was an optimistic, possibly complacent answer, but all I'm really saying is I'm not sure any of us yet fully know how significant the data center demand will be, because there certainly is a lot of scope for innovation.
Yeah, I don't want to ask AI. I want to ask you now. So how do you think
Yeah.
the world should respond to this rising demand from AI and data centers and
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I don't I don't want AI. It might give a smarter answer than me already. I don't know. I think the most important thing is that governments take a hard look at the technologies already available for much more efficient data centers, and very likely, in many cases, could insist that data centers are powered by and help to fund clean renewables technology. I think those are obvious steps that government could take to ensure that data centers don't drive more demand for fossil fuels. And I think, to be fair, some of the big tech companies are already trying to do a lot of that, and could be persuaded to accept a government role in forcing it across the industry.
Yes, and also I think another good news is that we see that economic growth is no longer tightly linked to emissions in most of the world, because a report by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit showed that 92% of the world's economies have now decoupled consumption-based carbon emissions and GDP expansion. So, how meaningful is that decoupling, and what do you think is driving this?
So this is it's another interesting one, because it's important to recognize in the early stages of economic development, when a country's doing basic industrialization, we've always had a clear relationship between economic growth and fossil fuel use and emissions. And that's basically building primary infrastructure. It takes a lot of steel and concrete. But actually, global emissions are dominated by the richer countries, where there is a lot more flexibility in the kind of energy that you use, and how, the value added in the service sectors, rather than just building more infrastructure. So actually, for 20, 30 years, some of us have been pointing out that in some of the leading economies, that relationship's already broken. And I think it's becoming more and more decoupled as we see the rise of clean energy and clean electricity, and the role of electrification in more advanced stages of development in transport, and in a number of other sectors. So I think this is a phenomena that is growing. I was very interested to see that figure of 90%. That's maybe higher than I expected. But I do think it's really showing that this idea that, you get richer, you have to use more energy forever is just wrong. It was never completely true, and now it's simply not true for most countries. As I say, poorest countries are going to need more energy for basic industrialization, but beyond that, we've got lots of other options, and we are seeing and will see even more decoupling.
Yes, of course. And does that mean countries will have more political will to decarbonize? Because if clean energy can become a driver for GDP growth, does that mean climate action become less about international treaties like the Paris Agreement and more about technology, markets, or national policy?
So I think the answer is both yes and no. I think that the global treaty and the global effort still has an important role. It shapes the goals that most countries agree to sign up to. It sets a framework of transparency so that you do know and you've got robust inventories and tracking measures. You know what countries' emissions are. They also report on measures taken. It creates a sense of we are in a combined effort to tackle this problem. And I think that is still valuable. But to be honest, the United Nations never was the place you were going to get strong obligations on exactly how to implement those commitments and those goals. Um, we did have a stronger treaty earlier, the Kyoto Protocol, that set legally binding limits on industrialized country emissions. That's no longer in the structure. It's probably impossible at a global level that all countries would sign up to that. But that's now been replaced by this reality that you referred to, which is really delivering what countries have signed up to internationally. Doesn't require global cooperation. A lot of it's driven by technology, markets, whole range of national policies. I think the one other thing, though, that add is there are some sectors where this is a lot harder to do unilaterally than in others. So in electricity, I mean, Europe has made big progress in decarbonizing its electricity, partly because it could afford to spend more for the technologies when they were more expensive and it didn't have to worry about electricity trade. Nobody's going to build a wire from Europe to the United States or to China to undercut European electricity. That's not true in some of the big industries like steel, where we trade products. And so you have a more complicated situation and a need for some kind of international cooperation, I think, to accelerate the transition to things like low carbon steel. So it's not a blanket, got a global agreement, it can set a target, but countries just go and implement it. There are some sectors where we really require cooperation, but it doesn't have to be global.
Yes, and also we've seen countries like Djibouti and Mauritania, they moved from almost zero to over 50% renewable energy in just a few years. And we're also seeing this solar boom in Africa thanks to solar panels from China. But does that suggest the global south can effectively leapfrog the fossil fuel era and use clean energy as the engine for their industrialization and energy independence?
So I think these are great examples. And I think that the answer is in some areas, absolutely yes. By that, I mean some countries and some sectors. The fact is now that for countries which, shall we say, have a functioning economic and legal system and are governing their electricity system reasonably well, solar energy is now the cheapest source of electricity. The International Energy Agency said in 2020 that solar energy is now the cheapest electricity in history. And that is really attractive. Why would countries want to do something else? There are circumstances in which countries still do other things for a variety of reasons. Some is just states that not functioning very well at all, and it's hard to do business to deliver the clean technology and to make sure that it's maintained, or it's hard to get a business model in that works, that people will pay because maybe electricity is totally subsidized or corrupted. There are some other systems. Indonesia, I think, is struggling with a situation in which they've kind of committed themselves to a lot of coal plants. There's a lot of political power in the coal industry, and that is fighting to stop the rise of renewable energy in pretty blunt terms from what I've seen. So it's not universal, but in general, developing countries will do better if they embrace zero carbon electricity sources. It's simply cheaper, it's cleaner, and that increasingly is true for transport as well, where it will also mean they avoid the kind of urban air problems that China has suffered, India still to a degree. So yeah, absolutely. Leapfrogging used to be a nice idea. Now increasingly it's a reality.
Okay, and climate finance was supposed to be one of the pillars of the Paris Agreement, with wealthy countries committing to support developing countries at a scale. But in reality, the money has somehow been delayed, uneven, or often structured as loans. So, why do we often find it difficult to turn those promises into real financial support on the ground?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most frustrating, difficult, divisive areas. The short answer is that even the rich countries don't feel very rich. And I think to some degree have struggled ever since the global financial crisis, which was quite a long time ago now. But it's also been seen that the world is now much more, many other areas of economic development beyond the old rich club of OECD countries. So there's been more reluctance to spend public money raised by taxes and quotes give it or transfer it to developing countries. And I think unfortunately it's a brutal reality also of democracy that people don't really like voting to give money away to other countries, to put it crudely. If that's seen, that's an easy thing for some of the, well, shall we say, some political parties to try and get votes by saying, you don't vote for a party that's going to give your money away to other countries. So, that has limited the scale of direct public finance. And the US has had a long-running deep division on that topic. And obviously, President Trump is not willing to spend a penny on foreign assistance in most respects. There's not much the world directly can do about that. Other countries can't really force the US or other rich countries to pay more. So I don't blame developing countries for being angry. I think there's a profound question as to whether they recognize that's the situation. I think there are some interesting dimensions on the international finance which are a bit more hopeful. And let me mention two, at least. One is that the discussion has gone beyond just the OECD countries. It remains that in terms of formal commitments, but I mean, frankly, China is a country which is now spending significant amounts abroad on clean technology in developing countries, partly because its own industry is often supplying those technologies, so it is sort of mutually beneficial. And China has agreed to report not as a commitment, but as part of its broad contribution internationally. So there's a recognition actually that this is not going to be a stark division between the old OECD and nobody else is paying anything, but it's going to be a more nuanced mix of contributions to the global effort. I think the other thing is recognition that we're never going to have the pace of transition required and the investment required from the public sector alone. A lot of it is going to become from private investment. The question then is, can governments actually help to make that money flow more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively towards low carbon development? And that can involve, for example, governments issuing risk guarantees so that you reduce the risk that private investors see in these areas in developing countries. So that's another angle. And I think that's also very important is getting the right mix between public finance and private international investment in clean tech.
Yes, and also we've seen the first UN approved carbon credits issued under the Article 6 of Paris Agreement this year, and it's about a clean cooking project in Myanmar. But how do you look at such kind of, clean cooking projects? Like, does it provide some, new opportunities for these developing countries to decarbonize, or is quite problematic at the same time?
I think it's both an opportunity and a problematic one. We have had international discussions about carbon markets for decades. We had an international carbon credit system, a little bit like this, with the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, which generated substantial international investment and arguably really helped to launch some of the clean technology industries, for example, in China and India. It's always going to be a bit controversial for a couple of reasons. That the basic idea of these mechanisms is that a country can claim some emissions credit for investment in a developing country project that reduces emissions in that other country. And so some people say, well, that's kind of cheating, sort of, because you should be focusing on reducing your own emissions, not paying others to do so. But the counter argument is it can be an effective way of getting international finance into countries where it would be very difficult otherwise. You are always going to have arguments over what projects are legitimate because you're kind of measuring how much did I save emissions relative to what would have happened otherwise. And well, I don't know what would have happened otherwise. So there's always this argument about what was the baseline for how many emissions have you really saved by that investment. I don't think those arguments are ever fully going to go away. But that doesn't mean you should close the door on all that. I think the clean cooking projects in Myanmar, others do bring real benefits. And it may be that we should have a slightly different philosophy, which is to say, are these projects beneficial? Are they accelerating low carbon and environmentally sustainable development? And maybe just a bit less attention to precisely how many emissions did they save, and was it fair that somebody claimed credit for at least some of those? Because I think the big picture here is we want these mechanisms to accelerate low carbon investment globally, and that ultimately should be the acid test.
Okay, well, I know that in some parts of Europe, these ambitious climate policies are increasingly being discussed alongside rising energy prices and living costs. So, has the green transition become harder to sustain politically because of the affordability concerns?
So, it's a great question because yes, we're in the thick of political struggles over this in several European countries, including the UK. We for 25 years or more have had a broad political consensus that, of course, climate change is a real concern and we have to decarbonize. That is now fractured. There is a fairly extreme right-wing party, which I think has been quite closely aligned with US interests and climate skepticism. That has also impacted our Conservative Party, which acknowledges that scientifically we need to get to net zero emissions, but it said, oh, but 2050 is too early and it's going to be too expensive. And so there's political games being played around this. And they're pointing to the cost of energy and affordability of energy. I think the crucial thing to say in this is it is a transitional challenge. I think it's pretty clear once you've built a clean energy sources, uh, they don't cost very much to run. I mean, their fuel is basically free. It's the sun and the wind. The issue is around the cost of building the capital in the first place. And at the moment in the UK, we have very high energy bills. And the reason is partly we're still paying for the old system. We still have our electricity prices set by natural gas, which is right now very expensive. And we're still paying for some of those earlier capital investments. And we're trying to build out further. So we're kind of paying for both the old system and the new system at the same time. And that's what's driving prices high to be crude. And there are structural inefficiencies actually in the way we've got, the fossil fuels in our electricity. That said, I think it is increasingly clear that prices will be coming down again because as you go further through this transition, you get to the point where you really are far less dependent on fossil fuels. You're getting much more energy from capital that's already been built and paid off. And so I think this argument will go away as the transition proceeds. In the UK, we've actually got a government that is still very committed to its climate targets and has made it plain that this is an area it's willing to engage in a major political fight. It is not sort of trying to deal with the opposition by saying, well, maybe we'll be less ambitious, etc. It's saying, no, we're doing the right thing and we're going to make the case that this is the right thing and it will bring Britain benefits.
Okay. So now we are moving into the next decade of the Paris Agreement, and obviously a lot has changed. So what do you think should be our top priorities for the next stage of climate actions?
I think the next stage of climate action, first, there is the geopolitical dimension. And I think it is a recognition that we regret the US leaving, but we're going to carry on. I think we acknowledge that when we're moving from goals to implementation, you can't deliver implementation actions totally at the global consensus. So where you need international collaboration, you're talking about, if you like, second tier agreements. The Brazilian government is talking very seriously about second tier structures which enable, say, 40 or 50 countries to say, right, we are going to work actively on decarbonizing this sector and we will cooperate in these ways to help build up both the technologies and the markets. So I think that is now an absolutely crucial phase of the next stage. I think the other priority is to reframe some of the financial structures around climate change. I think we need to recognize that climate change itself is a huge macroeconomic risk. It's a risk to insurance industries. It's a risk to all kinds of assets and industries around the world. And I think we need to build stronger coalitions of all of those who increasingly are directly seeing the impacts of climate change to say that those are the coalitions politically to help further accelerate the global action through all kinds of action across basically half a dozen sectors. So maybe if there's probably the end of the discussion, but we've framed the climate change issue before in terms of global targets or national emission targets, and that was fine and relevant because that's a scientific problem. Solving the problem means decarbonizing electricity, transport, heavy industry, heating, agriculture, and other aspects of land use. Do those and you solve the problem. So maybe now we move into what are the international conversations around accelerating those sectoral transitions.
Professor Michael Grubb, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.